Stray, so much astray.
Chapter 1: Mechanical and Artificial Entities. The first episode focused on what these things seem to be. This episode continues that look, but shifts attention to how they behave and what that behavior suggests about where they come from. Not appearance, but function. Not form, but implication. Mechanical and artificial entities occupy an odd place in encounter reports. They are rarely treated as the main event. They are noticed briefly, described with hesitation, and then set aside. And yet they appear again and again, across decades and locations, with a consistency that makes their secondary status difficult to ignore. Most descriptions are simple. Small metallic objects, smooth and geometrically plain. Spheres are common, as are elongated ovals and short cylinders. They hover without visible support and move without acceleration. Their motion does not feel like travel so much as repositioning, as if they are adjusting themselves within a fixed space. These objects appear indoors more often than expected. Bedrooms are common, but so are kitchens, hallways, and living rooms. They float near ceilings or pause directly above beds. Some emit a faint light. Others remain dark, noticeable only because they occupy space where nothing should be. Witnesses struggle to describe surface texture, often defaulting to comparisons with polished metal or stone. What these machines do is less clear. Some rotate slowly, shifting position around a body. Others remain stationary, as if monitoring or stabilizing something. In abduction narratives, they are often remembered as appearing before any biological entities and sometimes lingering after everything else fades. The pattern suggests preparation and cleanup rather than participation. They behave as if physical barriers are irrelevant. Walls and windows do not matter. This detail is so common that it is rarely emphasized, treated instead as expected. The machine appears where it needs to be, regardless of architecture. Mechanical entities are not limited to domestic encounters. Metallic objects with similar shapes are reported hovering over roads, fields, and bodies of water. Some are tracked on radar. Others leave no trace. Many are described as oblong or cylindrical, lingering briefly before accelerating away. This is where speculation widens. In 2017, astronomers detected Oumuamua, an interstellar object passing through the solar system. Its shape was unusually elongated. It showed no visible outgassing, yet it accelerated as it departed. No natural explanation fit particularly well, and the possibility of artificial origin was seriously discussed, if unresolved. Whether Oumuamua was artificial is almost beside the point. What matters is how easily it fit into an existing pattern. A long, silent object, behaving in ways that suggest design rather than accident, passing through space without obvious propulsion. It resembles, at scale, the smaller objects reported for decades much closer to home. Military encounters reinforce this pattern. Featureless tic-tac objects tracked by pilots and sensors. Spheres pacing aircraft. Cylindrical forms entering and exiting the ocean. These are not beings in any biological sense. They do not communicate. They do not react. They perform tasks. Machines imply manufacture. Manufacture implies infrastructure. Some witnesses describe devices flickering, malfunctioning, or being replaced during encounters, as casually as a faulty component swapped out for another. That detail suggests availability rather than rarity. One possibility is that these objects are probes or scouts. Another is that they are interfaces, designed to operate where other entities cannot or choose not to appear. There is also the possibility that they are the primary presence, and everything else is secondary. It is even conceivable that these machines are not sent from anywhere at all. That they are generated locally, assembled briefly, used, and withdrawn. If so, their origin is not a place, but a system, one that intersects with our environment as needed. Mechanical entities do not behave like visitors. They behave like components in an ongoing process, repeating quietly and efficiently, without concern for how they are perceived. This is strAInge, and today we're continuing our look at where these entities come from, and what their behavior suggests about how close that origin might actually be. Chapter 2. Insectoids, non-mantid. Insectoid encounters tend to appear at the margins of the record. They are not the mantids. They lack the height, the stillness, and the sense of supervision that often comes with those reports. When they show up, they are usually treated as anomalies, misclassifications, or details not worth pursuing. Descriptions vary, but certain features repeat. Segmented bodies. Limbs that bend at sharp angles. Hard, shell-like surfaces rather than skin. Ant-like forms are common, as are beetle-shaped bodies and narrow, wasp-like silhouettes. Size ranges widely, from something dog-sized to something closer to human height, though thinner and oddly proportioned. They are rarely encountered alone. Witnesses describe small groups moving quickly and without hesitation. Individuals separate and rejoin without visible signaling. There is little sense of individuality. Movement appears purposeful, but the purpose itself is rarely clear. These encounters do not usually take place in bedrooms. They are reported outdoors, near tree lines, fields, and waterways, or in garages, sheds, basements, and utility spaces. Construction sites and industrial areas come up with some regularity. The locations feel incidental, as if the setting matters less than access. People often describe stumbling onto these entities rather than being sought out. The encounter feels accidental. A door opened. A turn taken. In several reports, the entities pause when noticed, then resume whatever they were doing. There is no sign of alarm or curiosity. What they are doing is difficult to reconstruct. Digging is mentioned frequently, though rarely in a way that leaves lasting evidence. Sorting or manipulating objects also comes up, though witnesses struggle to identify what those objects are. Ground disturbance, damaged vegetation, or altered structures are sometimes noted afterward, but often nothing tangible remains. Insectoids are also reported appearing inside enclosed spaces without any clear point of entry. Walls, floors, and barriers do not seem to matter. This behavior is noted without emphasis, folded into the event alongside everything else. Time is unreliable. Witnesses lose track of duration. Memory centers on movement, texture, and shape rather than sequence. Details blur, especially around how the encounter began or ended. Speculation around insectoids has always been scattered. Some compare their behavior to that of social insects, emphasizing task over awareness. Others suggest they are constructed rather than biological, their segmented forms and repetitive movements shaped for function. There are also accounts that resist both explanations, describing surfaces that flex, sounds that scrape or click, and movements that feel improvised rather than mechanical. These encounters do not cluster neatly by region or tradition. Reports come from rural, suburban, and industrial settings without obvious pattern. They do not escalate. They do not repeat reliably. Many witnesses never report them at all, assuming what they saw was an animal, machinery, or a momentary misperception. Some reports place insectoid figures near larger phenomena without tying them directly together. Lights are seen at a distance. Equipment fails. Animals react before anything is noticed. In a few cases, witnesses return later to find areas altered, soil compacted differently, plants disturbed in ways that do not match known animal behavior. There are accounts where insectoid forms appear briefly and then withdraw without any clear direction of travel. They do not disappear into the ground. They simply stop being present. Witnesses struggle to describe this transition, often defaulting to language about fading or slipping rather than movement. Some encounters include sounds. Scraping, clicking, a dry rustle that does not match insects or machinery. Others include smells, metallic or sharp, present only for a moment. These details recur often enough to resist dismissal. What makes these reports difficult to integrate is their lack of narrative focus. The witness is not central. The activity appears to continue regardless of observation, and the presence of a person feels incidental rather than consequential. Insectoids do not fit comfortably into stories about visitors or messengers. They are not framed as intelligences attempting contact. They appear in motion, already engaged, elsewhere in their attention. Chapter 3: Childlike Entities. Reports involving childlike entities tend to provoke an entirely different reaction than most encounter narratives. They are often dismissed quickly, not because they are implausible, but because they are uncomfortable in a way that resists easy framing. These are not children in any ordinary sense, but they are described that way because nothing else quite fits. Witnesses describe small figures, roughly the size of human children, sometimes smaller. The proportions are usually wrong. Heads slightly too large. Limbs too thin. Movements awkward or hesitant. Faces are often described as blank or simplified, with expressions that do not settle into anything recognizable. Clothing, when mentioned at all, is vague and inconsistent, more impression than detail. These encounters are frequently brief. A figure seen at the edge of a road. Standing near a fence. Watching from the edge of a clearing. In some cases, the entity approaches, slowly and without urgency. In others, it remains at a distance, noticed only because it does not move the way a human child would. Settings matter here. Childlike entities are often reported near transitional spaces. Roads at night. Rural properties. The edges of towns. Places where people are passing through rather than staying. There are also accounts from inside homes, but these tend to be fleeting. A figure glimpsed in a hallway. Standing at the foot of a bed. Gone before anything can be said or done. The behavior described is inconsistent. Some entities appear curious, tilting their heads or shifting their weight as if uncertain. Others seem detached, watching without reacting. Communication is rare. When it is reported, it is minimal and unclear. Simple phrases. Requests that do not quite make sense. Sounds that resemble speech without resolving into language. There are cases where witnesses describe a strong emotional response that feels disproportionate to what was seen. Fear, certainly, but also confusion, sadness, or a sense of responsibility that is difficult to explain. The entity looks vulnerable, or lost, or incomplete. That perception lingers even when the witness cannot articulate why. Speculation around these entities varies widely. Some interpret them as juveniles of other known forms, though this rarely fits the reported behavior. Others suggest they are attempts at mimicry, forms constructed to appear non-threatening but missing key details. The resemblance to children may be functional rather than accurate, a rough approximation rather than an imitation. There are also reports where childlike entities appear alongside other phenomena. Lights in the distance. Mechanical objects hovering nearby. Larger figures observed later or earlier in the same area. The connection, if any, is unclear. The timing rarely aligns cleanly enough to draw conclusions. In a number of older cases, witnesses describe encounters with small people that predate modern terminology entirely. These accounts are inconsistent and often filtered through local folklore, but certain details recur. Small stature. Odd movement. Brief appearances followed by disappearance. The language changes, but the shape of the encounter remains recognizable. What complicates these reports is how rarely they escalate. There is no examination. No abduction. No clear purpose. The entity appears, is noticed, and is no longer there. The encounter does not feel unfinished so much as inexplicable, as if it was never meant to be understood in the first place. Some witnesses later report dreams or intrusive memories connected to the sighting, though whether these are related or retrospective is impossible to say. Others report nothing at all, aside from a persistent sense that the encounter did not belong to any known category. Childlike entities remain difficult to place because they do not align with expectations. They are not clearly observers, workers, or messengers. They do not behave like explorers. They do not behave like animals. They do not behave like children, despite the name. They appear briefly, imperfectly, and without explanation, and then they are gone, leaving behind the uneasy sense that resemblance does not always imply intent, and that familiarity may be the least reliable guide in trying to understand what was actually seen. Chapter 4: Luminous and Plasma Entities. Luminous encounters are often described as the simplest and the hardest to explain. There is usually no body in any recognizable sense. No limbs. No face. No structure that holds still long enough to be examined. What witnesses describe instead is light, shape, and motion, combined in ways that do not behave like ordinary illumination. These entities appear as glowing forms, sometimes spherical, sometimes elongated, sometimes irregular. Edges blur. Shapes change while being observed. Colors vary, though white, blue, and orange are common. In some reports the light is intense, painful to look at directly. In others it is soft and diffuse, more like a glow than a source. They are seen indoors and outdoors, in cities and rural areas, at night and in daylight. They drift through rooms. They hover near ceilings. They pass down hallways and through doorways without interacting with the space. Outdoors, they move across fields, along roads, over water, sometimes pacing vehicles or lingering just beyond reach. Motion is often described as smooth but not mechanical. These entities accelerate and decelerate without warning. They stop abruptly. They change direction without turning. Witnesses struggle to describe how the movement feels, often saying it does not resemble flight or falling, but something else entirely. There are reports where the light appears to respond to people nearby. It brightens when approached. It dims when ignored. In some cases, it moves closer, as if curious. In others, it retreats the moment it is noticed. Communication, if it occurs at all, is indirect. No words. No gestures. Just proximity and movement. Physical effects are sometimes reported. Heat without a clear source. A prickling sensation on the skin. Hair standing on end. Electrical interference is common. Lights flicker. Radios distort. Batteries drain unexpectedly. In a few cases, witnesses report burns or marks afterward, though these are inconsistent and difficult to attribute. Speculation around luminous entities has always overlapped with attempts at scientific explanation. Plasma formations. Ball lightning. Atmospheric phenomena. These explanations account for some details but fail to address others, particularly when the entities appear indoors, pass through solid matter, or display complex movement. There are older reports that describe similar phenomena using different language. Will-o'-the-wisps. Corpse lights. Ghost lights seen near swamps, graveyards, and isolated roads. These accounts vary widely, but the core elements recur: light without source, motion without cause, appearance without warning. In modern encounters, luminous entities sometimes appear alongside other phenomena. Mechanical objects nearby. Larger forms seen later or earlier in the same area. Time distortion. Memory gaps. The light itself may not be the main event, but it marks something happening in proximity. Some witnesses report repeated sightings in the same location. A glow that returns night after night. A light that follows a familiar path. Others report only a single appearance, brief and unrepeatable. There is no clear pattern to duration or frequency. What makes these entities difficult to classify is how little they resemble living beings, while still behaving in ways that feel deliberate. They are not random flickers. They pause. They reposition. They linger. They withdraw. The sequence feels intentional, even if the intent is unreadable. In a handful of reports, witnesses describe luminous forms entering the body or passing directly through it. These accounts are rare and often fragmentary, but they recur often enough to be noted. Sensations afterward range from nothing at all to lingering discomfort or altered perception. The absence of structure makes these encounters easy to dismiss and hard to integrate. There is nothing to interrogate. Nothing to follow. No clear before or after. Just light, movement, and the impression that something was present for reasons unrelated to observation. Luminous entities resist interpretation because they resist containment. They do not fit into narratives about visitors or workers or observers. They do not stay long enough to be understood, and they do not behave in ways that suggest they need to. They appear, they move, and they are no longer there, leaving behind altered spaces, confused witnesses, and the persistent sense that whatever was seen was not meant to be seen at all. Chapter 5: Artificial Human Mimics. Artificial human encounters are usually described as mistakes made in real time. The witness thinks they are dealing with an ordinary person until the interaction begins to fail. Nothing dramatic happens at first. There is no sudden transformation, no revelation. The wrongness emerges slowly, through timing, posture, and response. These entities are described as looking human at a glance. Average height. Familiar clothing. Faces that seem complete until attention lingers too long. Eyes that blink too rarely or not at all. Mouths that move slightly out of sync with speech. Skin that appears smooth in an unnatural way, lacking texture, or stiff where it should flex. Movement is one of the most consistent details. Artificial human mimics walk deliberately, as if selecting each step. Their gait is often described as careful rather than fluid. Gestures appear rehearsed. Head turns are abrupt. Smiles arrive suddenly and vanish without transition. There is no sense of momentum in their movements, only position. These encounters often take place in public or semi-public spaces. Parking lots. Sidewalks. Stores late at night. Residential streets. The entity blends in long enough to be noticed as strange rather than impossible. Witnesses describe a brief period of confusion before fear, a moment where social expectation overrides instinct. Speech, when it occurs, is limited and imprecise. Simple questions. Requests for help. Directions asked and then ignored. Voices are described as flat or oddly formal. Some witnesses report repeated phrases or answers that do not match the question asked, as if the entity is responding to a different exchange. There are encounters where the mimic attempts sustained interaction. Conversations that drift without purpose. Prolonged eye contact that feels invasive rather than communicative. The entity appears attentive but fails to respond appropriately to emotional cues. This mismatch often produces unease before conscious fear. Clothing is frequently noted. Outfits that feel generic or poorly coordinated. Shoes that appear unworn. In older reports, clothing styles are outdated or assembled incorrectly. In newer cases, the clothing is contemporary but bland, chosen to avoid notice rather than express identity. Some witnesses describe moments where the mimic seems to fail outright. Movement stops. Speech halts mid-sentence. The figure stands motionless before leaving abruptly or becoming unaccountably absent. These moments are often remembered with unusual clarity, as if the breakdown itself demands attention. Artificial human mimics sometimes appear near other phenomena. Lights in the sky. Mechanical objects nearby. Electrical interference. The relationship between these events is rarely clear, and the entity does not acknowledge them. The connection is often recognized only later. What complicates these encounters is how quickly they are rationalized away. Fatigue. Stress. Social awkwardness. The memory is downgraded to a strange person rather than something else. Only later, after encountering similar accounts, does the unease return. These entities do not behave like observers. They enter shared space. They participate just enough to be noticed. The interaction itself seems deliberate, though what is being tested or attempted remains unclear. Artificial human mimics persist in the record because they undermine familiarity. They suggest that resemblance does not require understanding, and that imitation may succeed briefly without comprehension. They are close enough to pass and distant enough to feel wrong the entire time, leaving behind encounters that feel incomplete, interrupted, and unresolved. Chapter 6: Ultraterrestrial Watchers. Reports of watcher-type entities tend to be quieter than most encounter narratives. There is usually no approach, no interaction, and no sense that the witness is meant to be involved. The defining feature is presence without engagement. Something is there and it remains there, watching, until it is not. These entities are often described as tall, thin, and indistinct. Faces are vague or obscured. Limbs appear elongated. Details refuse to settle. Witnesses struggle to remember features clearly, even moments after the encounter ends. What is recalled instead is posture and position. The figure stands still, often at a distance, framed against a doorway, a tree line, a hill, or the edge of a room. Encounters frequently take place during moments of transition. Late at night. Early morning. Times when people are waking, falling asleep, or moving between spaces. The setting feels liminal, though witnesses rarely describe it that way. They simply note that the moment felt wrong for reasons that were difficult to articulate. The watcher does not react when noticed. There is no startle response, no attempt to hide. In some reports, the figure slowly withdraws, stepping backward or fading from view. In others, it vanishes abruptly, leaving no clear sense of motion at all. The lack of response is often more unsettling than aggression would be. There are accounts where multiple witnesses observe the same figure from different angles. These cases are rare but persistent. Descriptions align so closely enough to suggest a shared experience, though details remain sparse. No one recalls communication. No one recalls movement beyond departure. Speculation around watchers often turns inward rather than outward. Some suggest these entities are not visitors but residents, existing alongside human environments without participating in them. The idea is not that they arrive, but that they are already present, occasionally intersecting with perception. Other interpretations frame watchers as monitoring systems rather than beings. Fixed points of observation. Something positioned rather than embodied. This would account for the lack of interaction, the limited movement, and the sense that the witness is incidental to the encounter. There are older accounts that resemble modern watcher reports closely, though the language differs. Figures seen standing silently at the edge of camps. Shapes observed on ridgelines at night. Presences noticed but never approached. The descriptions are often brief, as if elaboration felt pointless even at the time. What distinguishes watcher encounters is their emotional residue. Witnesses do not always report fear. More often they describe unease, intrusion, or a lingering sense of exposure. The feeling is not that something threatened them, but that something observed them without permission. These encounters rarely escalate. There is no follow-up. No message delivered later. No repeated contact. The experience stands alone, difficult to integrate with other reports, and resistant to interpretation. Some reports place watchers near windows, as if glass matters less as a barrier than as a frame. A figure is seen outside on a patio with no sound of a door. A face is visible at the edge of a curtain, then gone. In apartment buildings, witnesses describe a shape standing in a corridor that should have been lit, then finding the bulb unbroken and the hallway empty. In rural settings, the watcher appears at the tree line, where animals normally shift and fidget. There is often a sense that the watcher is not trying to be hidden, but also not trying to be seen. The placement is careless. A figure stands where it can be noticed, but only briefly, only at the edge of attention. If the witness looks away, the encounter ends. If the witness looks directly, the details blur. People begin talking about perception, about blind spots, about the way the mind fills in missing information. Some witnesses report a physical sensation tied to the act of noticing. Pressure in the ears. A sudden heaviness. A dull headache that arrives formed. Pets sometimes react first, staring or growling at empty space, then backing away. In a few accounts, the witness tries to approach and finds their body refusing, not paralysis exactly, more like reluctance so strong it feels imposed. The origin question gets messy here, because watchers do not behave like travelers. There is no craft. There is no entry or exit. The figure is simply present, as if it has stepped into the scene from a place that runs alongside it. If it is a being, it acts like one assigned to a post. If it is a mechanism, it acts like one placed to record. Chapter 7: USO-associated non-aquatic entities. Encounters tied to unidentified submerged objects tend to focus on the craft rather than what accompanies them. The emphasis is on movement through water, on entry and exit, on the way something large and solid behaves as if depth and pressure do not apply. What often gets overlooked are the reports that do not stay underwater at all. These entities are associated with water without appearing to belong to it. They are seen near coastlines, lakes, rivers, and reservoirs, but not swimming. Witnesses describe figures standing at the water's edge, moving along shorelines, or emerging briefly before retreating. In some cases, the craft is seen first. In others, the entity appears alone, with the water acting as context rather than origin. Descriptions are inconsistent but share certain traits. Bodies are usually humanoid in outline, though details are vague. Height varies. Limbs are often described as elongated or indistinct. Faces are rarely seen clearly. When they are, they lack detail or appear obscured, as if light or reflection interferes with perception. These encounters often occur at night or in low light, but not always. There are daylight reports from fishermen, dock workers, and people walking near water. In those cases, the figure is noticed because it does not behave like a swimmer, a diver, or a person engaged in ordinary activity. It stands too still. It moves without splashing. It enters water without resistance. Some witnesses report seeing figures emerge from the water without any sign of effort. No climb. No pull. The body simply rises to standing height, as if the water were not supporting or resisting it. In other accounts, the entity steps into the water and vanishes without a ripple, leaving the surface unchanged. Interaction is rare. The entity does not approach. It does not signal. It does not react strongly to being observed. In many cases, it appears to be waiting rather than arriving or leaving. The impression is of pause rather than transit. There are reports where these figures appear shortly before or after a submerged object is seen entering or exiting the water. Lights beneath the surface. A shape moving at impossible speed. A disturbance without waves. The relationship between the entity and the object is unclear. They do not interact visibly. They simply coexist within the same window of time. Speculation around these encounters often borrows language from both terrestrial and aquatic narratives without fully fitting either. Some suggest these entities are operators rather than occupants, interacting with craft designed to function across environments. Others treat them as observers stationed near access points rather than travelers themselves. There are older accounts that resemble modern reports closely, though described in different terms. Figures seen rising from rivers. Shapes standing motionless at the edge of lakes. Presences noticed near harbors without explanation. These stories are often brief, recorded without elaboration, and left uninterpreted even by those who experienced them. What complicates these encounters is the absence of clear boundaries. The entity is not clearly aquatic, yet remains tied to water. It does not swim, but it enters and exits with ease. It does not display traits associated with marine life. The water functions more like a threshold than a habitat. Witnesses often report a heightened sense of stillness during these encounters. Sound drops away. Movement slows. The environment feels suspended, as if attention itself has narrowed. When the encounter ends, the ordinary world resumes without transition. There is rarely follow-up. No repeated sightings. No escalation. The figure is seen once and not again. The memory lingers not because of what happened, but because of how little happened. Something was present, connected to a place people understand as a boundary, and then it was not. USO-associated non-aquatic entities persist in the record because they complicate simple categories. They are not creatures of the sea, yet they rely on it. They are not clearly visitors, yet they arrive and depart through spaces humans cannot follow. They appear briefly at the edge of perception, tied to depth, silence, and the sense that some environments serve as entrances rather than destinations. Chapter 8: Shadow and Silhouette Entities. Shadow encounters are often reported with a kind of reluctance. Witnesses hesitate not because the experience was unclear, but because it feels insubstantial when spoken aloud. There is no object to describe, no surface, no color that holds. What is remembered is shape defined by absence rather than presence. These entities appear as dark forms, darker than the surrounding environment, even in low light. They are described as silhouettes rather than bodies. Outlines are visible, but details are not. The shape is usually humanoid, though proportions vary. Some are tall and narrow. Others are compact, hunched, or oddly distorted. The edges are sometimes sharp, sometimes blurred, as if the form is not fully fixed. Shadow entities are most often encountered indoors. Hallways, stairwells, bedrooms, doorways. They stand where a person might stand, but without the depth or texture of a person occupying that space. Witnesses describe seeing them out of the corner of the eye, then turning to face them directly, only to find the shape unchanged rather than gone. Movement is inconsistent. Some shadows glide smoothly, crossing rooms without sound. Others move abruptly, appearing in one place and then another without crossing the space between. In a number of reports, the entity remains completely still, noticed only because it blocks light or alters the shape of a familiar room. These encounters often occur during moments of fatigue or transition, but not exclusively. People report seeing shadow figures while fully awake, engaged in ordinary activity. The timing does not always align with sleep-related explanations. The witness knows where they are. The environment is familiar. The shape does not belong. There is rarely interaction. The shadow does not speak. It does not gesture. It does not approach. In some cases, it retreats when noticed, slipping behind furniture, into corners, or through walls. In others, it simply vanishes, leaving the space unchanged. Speculation around shadow entities is wide and conflicting. Some interpret them as perceptual artifacts, though this fails to explain consistency across reports. Others treat them as entities that lack physical form, visible only as disruptions in light. In this view, the shadow is not the being itself, but the effect of its presence. There are older accounts that resemble modern shadow encounters closely, though described in different terms. Figures seen at the edge of firelight. Shapes moving just beyond torchlight. Presence is noticed but never illuminated. The language changes, but the experience remains similar. In some reports, shadow entities appear alongside other phenomena. Mechanical sounds. Electrical interference. Sudden drops in temperature. The connection is rarely clear. The shadow does not interact with these elements. It simply appears in proximity to them. Witnesses often describe a strong emotional reaction that arrives fully formed. Fear, certainly, but also a sense of intrusion or violation. The feeling is not that the shadow intends harm, but that it does not belong in the space it occupies. The environment feels compromised while it is present. What complicates these encounters is how difficult they are to document. There are rarely photographs. When images exist, they are inconclusive. The entity blends too easily into darkness. The absence of detail becomes part of the experience itself. Shadow and silhouette entities persist in the record because they resist categorization. They are not clearly physical, yet they occupy space. They are not clearly psychological, yet they are seen by multiple witnesses under similar conditions. They do not behave like observers or messengers. They simply appear, alter a space by their presence, and then leave it unchanged but no longer quite familiar. They are remembered not for what they did, but for how completely they disrupted the assumption that darkness is empty. Chapter 9: Liminal and Threshold Entities. Encounters involving liminal or threshold entities tend to occur in places already defined by transition. Doorways, stairwells, hallways, bridges, tunnels, property lines, and fence gaps appear again and again. These are not destinations. They are passages. The entity is not encountered within a space so much as at the moment one space gives way to another. Witnesses often struggle to describe the entity as a whole. Only part of a figure is visible. A head peering around a corner. A torso framed in a doorway. A shape standing just beyond the final step of a staircase. The rest feels implied rather than seen. The entity occupies the boundary itself, not fully committing to either side. Movement is usually minimal. The figure does not cross into the room. It remains fixed in place, watching or waiting. In some reports, it withdraws the instant the witness advances. In others, it remains until attention breaks, after which it is no longer there. The transition point seems to matter more than the observer. These encounters are often brief, but sharply remembered. The setting is familiar. The witness knows the space well enough to recognize that something is wrong. The doorway should be empty. The hallway should be clear. The shape does not belong there, and yet it occupies the space with certainty. Communication is rare. There are no gestures, no words, no signals. The entity does not attempt to interact. Witnesses frequently report a strong reluctance to approach, not paralysis exactly, but a sense that crossing the boundary would be a mistake. The hesitation feels imposed rather than chosen. Threshold entities are reported both indoors and outdoors. Figures stand at the edge of wooded paths, just beyond the reach of trail light. Shapes appear at the far end of bridges or at the mouth of tunnels. In urban environments, they are seen in the doorways of closed buildings or at the end of unlit corridors, positioned where access is restricted or uncertain. In some accounts, the entity appears only when the witness is already in motion. Walking toward a room. Climbing stairs. Stepping from one space into another. When the witness stops, the entity disappears. The timing is precise enough to feel coordinated, though no intent is communicated. There are cases where multiple witnesses describe the same boundary behaving strangely, even if they do not agree on what was seen. One person notices a figure. Another reports an overwhelming sense of presence. A third feels compelled to stop moving without knowing why. The space itself becomes the common element. Speculation around these encounters often centers on access rather than origin. The entity does not arrive from elsewhere. It appears where elsewhere might intersect. The boundary functions less like a wall and more like a seam, briefly revealing something that does not persist once crossed. Older accounts reflect the same structure, even when the language differs. Figures seen standing in gateways. Shapes appearing at crossroads. Presences noticed at the edge of firelight but never stepping forward. The terminology changes, but the geometry of the encounter remains consistent. What complicates these reports is how rarely they escalate. The entity does not follow. It does not pursue. It does not intrude beyond the threshold. Once the moment of transition ends, the experience ends with it. The witness is left on one side of the boundary with the sense that something remained on the other. Liminal entities resist classification because they do not behave like beings with destinations or goals. They appear tied to location rather than intent. They manifest where definition breaks down, and they vanish once it returns. What remains is the memory of a space behaving incorrectly. A doorway that briefly contained something that belonged to neither room. A passage that felt occupied rather than empty. The lingering sense that movement itself can draw attention from things that exist only where movement occurs. The final chapter. What ties these encounters together is not shape, origin, or intent. It is how often they appear at the edges of things people assume are stable. Rooms that should be empty. Roads that should lead somewhere. Moments that should pass cleanly from one second to the next. Again and again, the reports do not describe invasion so much as overlap. None of these entities behave as though contact is the goal. They do not announce themselves. They do not remain. They do not escalate. They appear briefly, perform no obvious act of communication, and withdraw or vanish without explanation. The witness is rarely addressed directly, and when interaction occurs, it feels incidental rather than intentional. Across species, the same patterns recur. Limited engagement. Partial visibility. Incomplete sequences. Encounters that feel interrupted rather than concluded. The impression is not of visitors arriving, but of systems already in motion, briefly intersecting with human awareness. Mechanical forms act without curiosity. Insectoid figures work without acknowledgement. Mimics interact without understanding. Watchers observe without response. Liminal entities remain fixed at boundaries. Temporal figures appear out of sequence. In each case, the encounter resists being framed as an exchange. What becomes difficult to ignore is how often these reports suggest proximity rather than distance. Not something far away arriving here, but something already close, already present, already embedded in places people do not normally notice. Hallways, thresholds, shorelines, moments between waking and sleeping, the edges of attention. This episode does not resolve where these entities come from. It does not claim they share an origin or a purpose. It simply continues the record, adding shape to a pattern that refuses to settle into a single explanation. In the next episode, strAInge will move away from classification and toward environment, looking at the places where these encounters cluster and why certain locations seem to produce them again and again. strAInge is written by ChatGPT. Read by Speechelo. With music by Murika.